The letter arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning, tucked among bills and supermarket flyers that Emma Clark would usually toss into the recycling bin without a second glance. The envelope stood out, thick cream paper, her name handwritten in careful cursive she recognized instantly. It was unmistakably her grandfather Henry's handwriting, the same she remembered from childhood birthday cards and the labels on his home-canned peach preserves. But Henry had passed away 2 months earlier, and Emma hadn't spoken to him in nearly 5 years before that. Her breath caught in her throat. She sat at her kitchen table in her small Boston apartment, fingers trembling slightly as she opened the envelope. Inside, a single sheet of paper held only one sentence. "Please visit our bench, Emma, the one in Central Park. I need you to go." It was signed with love, Grandpa Henry. Emma leaned back in her chair, confused and slightly unsettled. She hadn't thought about that bench in years. It was the one near the southern end of Central Park, just past the Literary Walk, under the shade of a tall American elm. She and Henry used to sit there when she visited him in New York as a child. He would tell her stories, made-up fairy tales, tales of his youth, or nonsense poems that made her laugh until her sides hurt. It was their spot, their secret world. But as Emma grew older and life grew heavier, those memories faded. Her relationship with her family had thinned to polite phone calls on holidays, strained and distant. Her father had disappeared when she was just 8 years old, and no one had ever given her a straight answer about why. Her mother remarried. Henry, the only family member who tried to hold on, had slowly slipped away from her life like mist in morning light. And now, even after death, he was asking her for something. A visit to an old bench. Emma stared out the window. Her schedule at the publishing house was tight. She was up for a promotion. She had plans. A weekend trip to Cape Cod with her boyfriend, deadlines for 2 upcoming releases, and a pile of manuscripts that never stopped growing. Still, something about the letter tugged at her. Not guilt exactly, but quiet ache. Maybe this was Henry's way of reaching out one last time, one final story to tell. She left for New York the next morning. The train ride from Boston to Penn Station gave her time to think, though she tried not to. She buried her face in a travel-sized novel she had edited 3 months prior, hoping it would distract her, but her mind kept drifting to Henry. He had been warm, eccentric, fiercely intelligent, a retired mechanic who could recite Robert Frost from memory and who kept a cigar box of old coins under his bed. There had always been something enigmatic about him, an undercurrent of quiet sadness he never fully explained. As the train pulled into the station, the city unfolded around her like a memory, loud, familiar, electric. She hadn't been back in years. By the time she reached Central Park, the late afternoon sun was casting long golden beams through the trees. She walked slowly, following the old familiar path past horse-drawn carriages and tourists, her hands buried deep in the pockets of her coat. The elm trees were still there, tall and rustling, their leaves just beginning to turn. And there it was, the bench. It looked exactly as she remembered. Wooden slats faded by weather and time, metal armrests cool to the touch. She hesitated before sitting, half expecting Henry to be there waiting with his crooked smile and a bag of roasted peanuts. But of course he wasn't. Emma sat down slowly, letting the silence settle around her. The distant sound of the saxophone drifted through the trees. She closed her eyes and let herself remember his voice, the way he used to pat her knee when telling a joke, the warmth of being known without judgment. Her throat tightened. She whispered aloud, "I'm here, Grandpa." The breeze stirred the leaves above her. For a moment, she felt foolish. She had come all this way for what? Nostalgia? Closure? There was no message, no revelation. Just an old bench and too many memories. She sighed, her eyes drifting downward. That was when she noticed something strange. Tucked beneath the bench, nearly hidden in the shadow where the metal slats met the support beam, was a small strip of dark duct tape. She leaned forward, heart skipping, and peeled it back carefully. Something metallic clinked against the wood. It was a narrow, flat compartment, almost like a hidden box, wedged between the slats. Someone had gone to great effort to make sure it wouldn't be easily seen. With a few gentle tugs, Emma pulled it free. Inside was a thin metal case, slightly rusted, cool to the touch. Her fingers hesitated on the latch before opening it. Inside was a single envelope with her name written again in Henry's careful hand. And beneath it, an old iron key, small, antique-looking, the kind that belonged to a music box or a jewelry cabinet, or something much bigger. Emma opened the letter. There were only 10 words. The truth was always closer than you ever imagined. H. She stared at the paper, mind racing. What truth? What was this key for? She looked around instinctively, but no one nearby seemed to notice her. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't just a sentimental gesture. Henry had hidden something. Something meant only for her, and he had waited until after his death to lead her here. Emma closed the case and slid it into her tote bag, her fingers brushing the cool metal of the key. She stood slowly, her heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. This wasn't just a bench anymore. It was a beginning. Emma didn't sleep much that night. After leaving Central Park, she checked into a modest hotel on the Upper West Side, her mind caught in a whirlwind of questions. She had placed a key and letter on the small desk in the room and stared at them for hours, trying to extract meaning from so few words. The truth was always closer than you ever imagined. The sentence looped in her mind like a riddle. The phrase wasn't just poetic. It was deliberate. It was Henry's voice speaking directly to her from beyond the grave, and she couldn't ignore the gravity of it. Morning broke with a pale, overcast sky and the dull hum of city traffic below her window. Emma wrapped her coat tightly around her as she stepped outside, the metal case tucked deep into her bag. The city, with all its noise and motion, felt strangely distant, as if she were walking through a film set, disconnected from everything around her. Her thoughts were consumed not just by the key and the message, but by what it implied, that Henry had carried a secret, one he had kept from everyone, one that somehow belonged to her now. She stopped at a coffee shop on Amsterdam Avenue, not because she wanted coffee, but because she needed to sit somewhere and think. She ordered a black coffee, sat at a window seat, and pulled the case onto the table. With the letter already committed to memory, she focused on the key. It was old, not just vintage, but antique. The iron was cool and slightly worn, the edges smooth from years of handling. It had no labels, no markings, no indication of what it might open, but it had weight, not just physical, but emotional. This wasn't random. It had been hidden for a reason. Emma opened her laptop and began searching. She didn't know where to begin, but she typed antique key identification into the search bar and scrolled through pages of examples. Nothing matched exactly, but some looked similar. Mostly keys from the early 20th century, used for cabinets, safes, old storage lockers. She shifted her search. If the key wasn't symbolic, but practical, it had to lead somewhere. Somewhere Henry had access to. Somewhere that meant something to both of them, or at least to him. An idea surfaced, sharp and sudden. The old bicycle workshop. She remembered it vaguely, from stories he used to tell her when she was little. Before retiring, Henry had owned a repair shop in Queens. He talked about it with a kind of reverence, like it had been his personal kingdom. He closed it before she was even born, but once, during one of her childhood visits, he'd pointed at a picture on the wall of a younger version of himself standing in front of a brick storefront, holding a wrench like it was a trophy. "That place taught me everything about fixing what's broken," he had said. Emma pulled out her phone and searched for Bicycle Repair Shop Henry Clark, Queens. It took some digging, but eventually she found an old business listing for Clark's cycle repair on an industrial block in Long Island City. The shop had closed over 30 years ago. The building, according to a few forum threads, still stood, boarded up and forgotten between a laundromat and a metalwork supplier. It wasn't much, but it was the only real lead she had. She took a cab to Queens. The drive was long, the streets narrowing as they moved away from the manicured avenues of Manhattan into the rougher, rust-stained outskirts of the city. When they finally turned onto the block, Emma's heart dropped. The area was nearly deserted. Most of the shops were shuttered or in decay, a row of forgotten businesses left behind by time. But there, sandwiched between two newer structures, was a building. The faded lettering above the metal gate Still red Clark Cycle Repair, barely visible through decades of grime. Emma stepped out of the cab, the smell of oil and rust hanging heavy in the air. She walked to the front of the shop. The windows were covered in sheets of plywood, the main gate padlocked and rusted shut. She walked the perimeter, hoping to find another way in, but every entry point seemed sealed. Frustrated, she stood back and stared at the building, debating her next move. "Can I help you?" a voice called. Emma turned sharply. A man in his early 30s stood across the street, wearing a mechanic's apron and wiping his hands with a rag. He had a warm, curious face. "I'm sorry," Emma said, approaching him cautiously. "I'm looking for someone who used to own this place." "Henry Clark. He was my grandfather." The man smiled slightly. "You're his granddaughter? That's wild. I never met him, but my dad used to talk about him. Said he was a legend around here. I'm Kyle, by the way. I run the auto shop across the street. Nice to meet you. Do you know if anyone's used this building since he closed it?" "Nope. Been empty for decades. City probably forgot it exists. You trying to get in?" "I think he left something inside for me. I just don't know how to." Kyle looked both ways, then nodded toward his shop. "Give me 10 minutes. I might have something that can help." True to his word, Kyle returned with a set of bolt cutters and an encouraging grin. "Just don't tell anyone I help you break into your own family's place." Together, they cut the rusted padlock and slid the heavy gate open with a loud metallic groan. The air inside was thick with dust and time. Cobwebs clung to every surface. Shelves sagged under the weight of old tires, broken frames, and forgotten tools. Emma stepped inside slowly, her breath catching in her throat. It felt like stepping into a preserved memory. The air was still, almost sacred. She walked past a workbench where Henry had probably spent countless hours. There were notes scrawled on the walls in faded marker, measurements, parts lists, names. She scanned the space, searching for anything that might match the shape or size of the key. Then she saw it. At the back of the shop, half concealed behind a stack of dusty boxes, stood a metal cabinet bolted to the wall. It was small, nondescript, and had a keyhole at its center, a keyhole shaped exactly like the one on the bench's hidden case. Her heart pounded. She reached into her bag and pulled out the key. It slid in perfectly. With a soft click, the door opened. Inside, stacked neatly in bundles wrapped with twine, were dozens of envelopes, old photographs, and collection of journals, all labeled with dates spanning over 30 years. But what caught her attention most was a thick envelope marked for Emma in bold, black ink. Hands shaking, she reached for it. This wasn't nostalgia anymore. It was something far deeper. Something she had never expected to find. Emma sat on the floor of the workshop, the envelope trembling slightly in her hands as she broke the seal. Dust particles floated through the beams of light coming in from a broken window above, the air thick with a strange sense of reverence. Everything in this place felt suspended in time, untouched, preserved, like it had been waiting for her to return. But there was something different about this envelope. Unlike the previous letter, which had been cryptic and brief, this one was heavy with pages, almost like a confession waiting to unfold. She unfolded the first page, Henry's handwriting instantly recognizable, tighter and more hurried than before, as if written under a sense of urgency. He addressed her directly, not just as his granddaughter, but as someone he was finally ready to tell the truth. He wrote of regrets and mistakes, of moments he had hidden not out of shame, but out of a desperate attempt to protect the people he loved. Emma read each line slowly, the words soaking into her like ink into parchment. The letter detailed a part of Henry's life she had never known. During the early 1990s, the workshop had become more than a repair shop. It was where Henry and his son, Michael, Emma's father, would meet late at night, working not only on bikes but on a side project involving custom mechanical components. According to the letter, they had developed a unique piece of cycling technology that had drawn attention from investors. One of them, Henry claimed, was a well-connected businessman named Richard Voss, now a high-profile figure in the corporate world. Things had gone sour quickly. Voss allegedly manipulated documents, shifted blame, and when the prototype went missing during a theft no one could explain, all fingers pointed to Michael. The scandal that followed crushed their small business, and Eventually, the family itself. Henry wrote that Michael hadn't run away. He had been forced into silence by a legal settlement meant to protect him from criminal charges. Voss had the influence and the money to make sure Michael took the fall quietly. In the aftermath, Henry fought to clear his son's name, but everything he tried had been shut down, dismissed, or buried. He had failed, but he never stopped documenting everything. Emma flipped through the rest of the envelope and found a list of items stored somewhere inside the shop. Files, schematics, letters, copies of bank records, and even photographs that, according to Henry, were irrefutable evidence of betrayal that had destroyed their family. One detail in particular caught her attention. Henry had constructed a false wall inside the workshop to hide the more sensitive materials, a literal door behind the clutter, hidden in plain sight. Heart pounding, Emma rose and began searching. The light inside the workshop was dim, but her eyes had adjusted. She began clearing boxes, pulling aside old frames, cardboard tubes, and cracked wooden crates. Dust filled her lungs, but she kept going, driven now by something she couldn't quite explain. This wasn't just about her grandfather or her father anymore. It was about the lie that had shaped her entire life. She had grown up believing her father had abandoned them. She had lived with that scar for over 20 years. And now it might be a lie. After nearly an hour of moving debris, her fingers brushed against something that fell off, a wall panel that flexed under her touch, unlike the solid ones around it. She pressed harder, and a section of it shifted slightly, revealing a seam she hadn't seen before. She found a crowbar nearby and carefully pried the panel open, though it creaked, reluctant after decades of stillness, and then gave way. Behind was a small door, not much taller than her waist, made of thick steel and set into the concrete foundation. It had a lock, but when she tried the same key Henry had left at the park, it turned with a soft click. The door swung inward with a groan. The hidden room beyond was small and cold. No windows. A single light bulb dangled from the ceiling, its cord brittle with age. Emma tugged it, and a weak yellow glow filled the space. What she saw took her breath away. The walls were lined with shelves, and the shelves were filled with boxes, binders, and envelopes, each carefully labeled with dates and descriptions. There were Polaroids pinned to a corkboard, handwritten notes tacked beside them, even audio cassettes stacked in plastic containers. On the far wall hung a large blueprint, the prototype her grandfather had mentioned. It was yellow, but the lines were precise, with Michael Clark's name signed at the bottom in faded ink. Emma stepped inside, afraid to touch anything at first. This was more than a hiding place. It was an archive, a chronicle of everything Henry had tried to piece together in the years after his son was erased from the story. There was bitterness in his notes, but also meticulous hope, as if he believed someone, someday, would come looking. On one of the shelves, she found another envelope addressed to her. This one was shorter, with a single sentence. "Find the truth, and even if it costs you everything." Her stomach tightened. She spent the next several hours in the workshop, cataloging what she could. Many of the documents were written in shorthand, some in technical jargon she didn't fully understand. But one thing was clear. There was a trail of evidence that, if followed, could potentially expose everything. Voss's signature appeared on multiple pages. There were photographs of meetings, ledger entries, and one particularly damning letter from a lawyer that hinted at a payoff to ensure Michael's silence. The deeper she dug, the more certain she became that this wasn't just family drama. It was a cover-up involving people who still held power today. As the sky outside darkened, Emma sat on the workshop floor. The material spread out around her like the pieces of a shattered puzzle. Her heart was heavy, but also burning with clarity. She had spent most of her adult life running from the past, building walls, avoiding family history, because it hurt too much. But now, Henry had pulled her back into it, not to haunt her, but to arm her. There was one more item she hadn't opened yet, a folder labeled Michael Clark, Final Correspondence. Inside were 3 letters. One was addressed to Henry, the others to Emma. Her hands trembled as she read the one written to her. Michael had written it 2 years ago. He was alive. He had been living under another name in a small town in Oregon. He said he had been following Emma's career quietly, proud of her, afraid to reach out, uncertain if she had believed the lies. And now maybe she didn't. Emma folded the letter and pressed it to her chest, her eyes stinging with tears. This wasn't the end of the journey. It was the point of no return. Emma left the workshop long after night had fallen, the cold air outside biting against her flushed skin. She had packed the most important documents into her bag, careful not to draw attention to herself as she locked the building again. The streets were nearly empty, but her pulse didn't slow until she was back in Manhattan, the city's hum providing a strange sense of camouflage. Still, the weight in her bag felt heavier than the metal case had ever been. She wasn't just carrying old papers anymore. She was carrying the fractured line of her family story, and maybe the match that could set fire to someone else's carefully constructed empire. Back in her hotel room, Emma spread the documents across the bed, arranging them in chronological order. The evidence was damning. Signed contracts, altered invoices, technical schematics with disputed ownership, and letters that hinted at threats made behind closed doors. Her father's name was tied to all of it, always in the role of the accused, never the accuser. Voss's name appeared just as often, but only in context that shielded him from responsibility. She saw, with new clarity, the deliberate construction of a false narrative, one that had worked for decades. But exposing it wouldn't be simple. As an assistant editor at a publishing house, Emma knew how powerful connections could be, especially in New York. She also knew that Voss wasn't just an untouchable name in corporate circles. He had recently partnered with her company on a lucrative memoir project. His influence reached far beyond the world of business, and if she moved against him, she could jeopardize her own career in an instant. It wasn't just about risking a job. It was about stepping into a battle against someone who had the resources to crush her. Emma sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing her temples. She thought of Henry, spending decades quietly collecting these records, knowing the cost of bringing them to light. He had left it to her, not because it would be easy, but because maybe he knew she would reach a moment in her life where protecting comfort would no longer be enough. The following morning, she made a decision. She needed counsel, someone outside the family who could confirm whether the documents could stand up to legal scrutiny. She called an old college friend, Olivia Reed, who now worked as an investigative journalist for a major New York magazine. They hadn't spoken in over a year, but when Emma explained that she had information about corporate fraud tied to a powerful figure, Olivia didn't hesitate to agree to a meeting. They met in a quiet coffee shop in Tribeca, far from Olivia's newsroom. Emma slid a manila folder across the table, her hands tied around the edge until Olivia took it. "This is a lot," Olivia murmured as she flipped through the pages. "If this is real, it's enough to reopen an investigation. But you understand what this means? Voss's political allies, media allies. You'll be going against people who know how to make inconvenient voices disappear." Emma nodded. "I know, but my father lost his life as he knew it because of him. And my grandfather, he spent everything trying to fix it. If I don't do something, then all of this just stays buried." Olivia closed the folder. "Then you have to be prepared for backlash. If you move forward, you can't half commit. Once it's public, you'll be in it for the long haul." Emma walked back to the hotel with the words echoing in her mind. You can't half commit. The decision felt heavier than any she had made before. Publishing the truth could destroy Voss's reputation, maybe even free her father from decades of silence. But it could also make her a target, not just in her career, but personally. The publishing world was small. People remembered who disrupted the power balance, and rarely did they forgive it. That night, she couldn't stop picturing two possible futures. One where she put the folder in a locked drawer and walked away, and another where she lit the match Henry had left her. In the first, she could keep her job, her apartment, her quiet life. In the second, she could finally give her father back his name, but at a cost she couldn't yet measure. Her phone buzzed just after midnight. It was an unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something told her to answer. "Emma?" The voice was male, low, hesitant. Her breath caught. "Dad." There was a pause, as though the man on the other end was weighing whether to speak again. "I heard you've been asking questions. Be careful. They're still watching. Henry tried to protect you by keeping you out of this. If you go forward, you'll be walking into something you can't walk back out of." The line went dead before she could say another word. Emma stared at the phone, her heart hammering. It wasn't a warning from a stranger. It was her father, alive and aware of what she was doing. His words weren't a plea to stop, but they were a reminder of what she was up against. She set the phone down slowly and looked at the spread of papers on the bed again. She thought about the bench in Central Park, about the key, about the hidden room behind the false wall. Every step had brought her closer to this point. And now there was no one left to pass the decision to. It was hers alone. By dawn, she had made her choice. Emma's decision crystallized in the stillness of early morning, when the city was nothing but distant sirens and the muffled hum of delivery trucks. She sat at the hotel desk, her laptop open, the files Henry had left spread around her like pieces of a long-buried truth. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she began typing. Not an email, but a draft of an article. She didn't trust anyone else to tell this story the way it needed to be told. The title came first, a sharp line that carried weight. The theft of an invention. How corporate greed silenced the Clark family. By the time the sun was fully up, Emma had turned Henry's decades of meticulous records into a cohesive narrative, carefully citing each document, photograph, and letter. Every claim was backed by proof. Contracts signed in Voss's own hand, memos hinting at legal manipulation, and a damning letter from the attorney that revealed hush money had been paid. She included the blueprint of the original prototype and side-by-side comparisons with the product Voss's company had released years later, earning millions. She emailed the full package to Olivia with a brief message. "It's ready. Publish it as is." An hour later, Olivia called. "This is going to explode, Emma. Once it's out there, you won't be able to control where it goes." "Are you sure?" Emma's voice was steady. "I've never been more sure about anything." The article went live that afternoon. Within minutes, it began to spread, first on a magazine's homepage, then through social media, and by evening on national news outlets. Headlines multiplied, some calling it a corporate scandal, others framing it as a David versus Goliath story. Former employees of Voss's company began coming forward with their own accounts, corroborating Emma's evidence. The backlash was immediate. Voss released a statement calling the accusations false and malicious, but the documents Emma had provided were impossible to dismiss. Stock prices in his company dipped overnight. A congressional committee announced they were reviewing the case. And in Emma's inbox, messages poured in, from strangers, from journalists, and from people who had known her father but never dared to speak. 3 days after publication, Emma received an email with no subject line. It was from Michael. The message was short. "Meet me where it all began. Tomorrow noon." She knew exactly where that was. The following day, she took the train back to New York and walked to the bench in Central Park. The air was crisp, the sky a muted gray. She sat and waited, her hands folded in her lap. At noon exactly, a man approached from the path, tall, his hair streaked with gray, his face lined but familiar in a way that made her chest ache. "Dad," she said, standing. He stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "You look just like your mother when we first met," he said quietly. Then, after a pause, "Henry would be proud of you." The sound of his voice up close felt unreal. They sat, and for a long moment neither spoke. Finally, Michael said, "I stayed away because I thought it was the only way to keep you safe. When they took the prototype, I became the story they wanted. Your grandfather fought for me every day, but he knew what would cost you if you got pulled into it. He wanted you to have a normal life." Emma's throat tightened. "Normal doesn't mean much if it's built on lies." Michael nodded slowly. "You're right, and now you've done what I couldn't." They talked for hours about the years he had spent living under another name, the places he had worked, the way he had kept track of her life from a distance. He told her about the guilt, the nights he thought about calling but didn't, the hope that someday the truth would come out without her having to suffer for it. As the light began to fade, Michael reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn leather journal. "Henry wanted you to have this. He started writing it the day you were born. It's not about the case. It's about you." Emma took it carefully, her fingers tracing the creases in the cover. She imagined Henry sitting at the same bench, scribbling down her milestones, her quirks, the moments he never wanted to forget. She felt the weight of it, not the heaviness of secrets this time, but of love preserved. When they finally stood to leave, Michael placed a hand on her shoulder. Whatever happens next, you're not alone anymore. Emma returned to the bench 2 weeks later, alone. The case against Voss was moving forward, and her life had changed in ways she couldn't yet measure. She sat in the same spot, opened a journal, and read the first entry. Emma is the brightest part of my life. Someday she'll know it. She smiled faintly, tears warming her eyes. Then she reached into her bag, pulled out an envelope, and tucked it beneath the bench. It contained a single note, and signed, "The truth will always wait for you here." As she walked away, she knew the bench would always hold their story, one of loss, resilience, and the courage to face what others had tried to bury. It was no longer just a place of memories. It was a monument to a family reclaimed.